I really, maybe we can get to my role, my small role in really helping out terrible coffee for a company called Folgers by accident when I was in grad school. So I had nothing to do with coffee really until I got here. When I moved to Bridgewater, I learned that Equal Exchange was in this area. They were then at Canton, and I thought that was pretty cool. And I can't remember how I made the connection, but somebody introduced me to Rodney North, and who was I think when he left Equal, his title was like coffee director or something like that. And he came to my class and talked about his travels in Central America. And my main reason for inviting him is I had a degree in Latin American studies, but I'd been to Mexico and Brazil. I hadn't been to Central America at all. And I just wanted somebody to come in and talk about that firsthand. So he did. That was in 1999. And a few years after that, I took my first coffee trip to Nicaragua with the help of other people at Equal, helped me just make the connections. And it totally changed my life. So since 2006, some people think that coffee is all I teach. It really isn't. But it has sort of taken over my life. And it really started with a passion for the farmers and their land. Over time, I've gotten to be known as a bit of a coffee snob. And I think today our talk is about the connection between the two. The quality of the coffee in the cup, such as I'm having right here, is related to the farmers and the land. And I am not an expert on quality, but fortunately, Mike is. And that's why we're both here today.
Great, thanks, James. My name is Mike Mowry. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking some time to join us. I will have been at Equal Exchange for 14 years come August 1st. And so I work in quality control at Equal Exchange. And my experience before that is when I was in college, I managed a cafe for 5 years, a student-run cafe. So, and I grew up in Seattle. So my grandma always used to say that I started drinking coffee at a really young age. So it stuck. And now my job is basically to be 100% focused on the quality piece when I'm at work. So that includes cupping, which is basically the sensory analysis, the fancy way of saying how we taste coffee systematically, and blending, and some work with producers and roasting and all things that relate to the quality of the coffee that you get from Equal Exchange. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
So what do you think, Danielle? Do you want to show any of the images?
So we have a few kind of slides, and so most of them are focused on not a lot of words, but really just like showing the producers and some of the processes. But I guess like just to kind of frame it for us, like I think most people here are consumers, right? And so how do we understand coffee quality? How do we think about it? I think we've all kind of walked into this like hipster coffee shop with all these pour overs and like single origin and what the elevation is. And, you know, so to me, there's so much more to coffee quality when we think about origin and things that we should be paying attention to as consumers. And so there's kind of a lot more to the story behind that little card that's like, this is the elevation, this is the cooperative that's being used. And so I kind of want us to have a conversation and just dig into that a little bit. And Equal Exchange has this kind of more complex approach to quality that I think is really unique, that folks don't often understand. And so I'm just really excited for Mike to kind of share that, and for James to kind of share more on his experience, like traveling to all these different places and how important quality is to the producer and their involvement in quality as well. So if you guys want to either start with some of the pictures, I decided to make a cup of Ethiopian because Mike has some pictures from his trip to Ethiopia. So I thought that would be fun.
Sure.
Not that everyone had to make a cup of coffee, but I just am drinking it all the time anyway, so.
Nice. Yeah, so maybe it would help if I sort of framed the quality steps that we have at Equal Exchange. So Equal Exchange is quite a bit different than most roasters, truly different. And one of the main reasons is that we import directly from producer cooperatives. So a lot of coffee roasters that you're familiar with, especially the sort of smaller coffee roasters, don't do the direct importing work. There's a lot of risk associated with direct importing. And lots of times companies are not of scale to assume the cost and the risk of that work. So every year we will go to the cooperatives, the producer cooperatives that we work with, and we'll make contracts. So let's say, we'll talk specifically about Ethiopia because we're going to show you slides for it. But I think last year we made 7 contracts with one exporting union in Ethiopia called the Sidama Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union. What that means is we import, let's see, if it's 50,000 times 7, something like, 200,000 pounds of coffee, 300,000 pounds of coffee from this one group in Ethiopia. So every year we'll make a contract. Before they start harvesting, we'll say, we're going to buy 7 coffees from you this year. And then as soon as they start harvesting, their quality department, it's run by a man named Deme Regasa, who's a friend of mine, he will start putting coffees together from the different small farmer cooperatives that we purchase from, and they'll sort them, they'll do the cleaning that's necessary on the coffee, and then they'll start sending us samples from those coffees to fill the contracts that we've made. So throughout the year, it's timed so that we receive the coffees at different times. They'll send us the samples to represent the contracts, and then we put the samples through a bunch of different testing. So we break that testing into 2 major parts. One we call the physical analysis, and one we call the sensorial analysis, which is the tasting piece. So the physical thing is we're going through, we're measuring density, moisture, the size of the beans. We're sorting through a 350 gram sample bean by bean, looking for different defects that we recognize. And these can be things like damage from coffee berry borer, different pests that happen on farms. We can find processing errors, cut beans, broken beans, foreign objects, those kind of things. And we have a certain amount of specifications that are acceptable for each contract. Those aren't our standards. We don't just make up standards and willy-nilly. We follow standards set by the Specialty Coffee Association, which is internationally recognized. What's cool about that organization is that all of the cooperatives that we buy from are familiar with those standards, and oftentimes those are their standards as well. So we're working within the same language, within the same guidelines. So we'll do the physical analysis. We'll look at the beans, make sure they're clean, make sure there's a good density, the moisture content's not too high or too low. And then we'll roast a small sample in the lab, the coffee lab. And then the next day, because coffee needs to rest after roasting, the next day we cup it. So we put it through a whole bunch of different testing on the cupping table. So we're looking for the flavor of the coffee, the aftertaste of the coffee, mouthfeel, acidity, cleanliness, if the coffee is sweet, because we want to make sure it's sweet. And we also want the coffee to taste interesting. So we want it to have the characteristics that we're familiar with the groups that we buy from. I could go and go and go on and go on and get deeper and deeper, but maybe I'll let some of that happen naturally. But to say, a lot of the groups we've been working with for decades, so the trade relationship in terms of quality at this point is very clear. They know what we expect as a buyer, and we know what to expect from them as producers in terms of the quality piece. So that makes the trade relationship a lot easier. And over time, those things get, when you're first starting a trade relationship based on quality, there can be some rough patches where you might taste a coffee and be like, that's really not what we're interested in, or do you have something else that would match this profile, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all about relationship building, and which helps the quality piece over time. I'll leave it at that because it could really go on for like an hour and a half.
I'd say a couple of things about the geography of what Mike was just saying. One is that this is my map of the world. The coffee comes, it originated in Ethiopia, and it grows within a belt between the tropics in about 50 or 60 different countries, produce coffee within that belt. And he mentioned the profile they're looking for. Part of the reason for that is in different parts of the coffee belt, we learn to expect different kinds of flavors, sweeter, fruitier, nuttier, lots of different profiles having to do with the soil, having to do with what varietals or subspecies are there, and having to do with just the traditional processing. Some places like Ethiopia does a natural process. We see wet processes in Central America typically, and you just get a bit different flavor. So there are expectations that are regional. The other thing I think geographically that's kind of interesting is that within the tropics, we have a lot of different climates within the tropics. Some are hot, some are dry, some are wet, some are too wet, some are too dry. So within the different parts of the tropical belt, what we call the coffee belt, it's at certain elevations that we tend to find the consistency of rainfall, the consistency of temperature that allows coffee to thrive. That's why it's not just everywhere. And I guess the other really important geographic thing is there are big plantations, but that's not what Equal Exchange works with. They work with small farmers. And a small farmer generally cannot, the amount of coffee that a typical family farm produces is not enough to warrant shipping, 5,000 miles to West Bridgewater, just a 500-pound package. So they work with cooperatives just because the coffee needs to be grouped for an economy of scale, both for getting it out and then for taking it in. So everything kind of gets moved through units of measure that are more like 30,000 pounds or 40,000 pounds instead of hundreds, and so that's why the cooperatives. The other way to deal with that is just work with big brokers or big companies, but then the individual farmer is lost in that process.
I have a question too, so how would you say that producers are kind of involved in the process of quality and how that's kind of shifted over the years, Mike, for maybe Equal Exchange? I think we kind of have this relationship where we're sharing results from tastings with people and maybe what their involvement is. I can only, speak for the one cooperative that I went to, but they basically had their own quality process and incentive program that they kind of implemented with their members, where there was a little, for all the people, the top 5, they kind of got an extra kickback and premium and lower 5 it's, and it's small, right? It's not huge, but just a little kind of extra incentive. So I don't know, if you similar things.
So that'll, as you can imagine, because each cooperative is basically its own business and has their own set of circumstances, but there are different ways of incentivizing, and I think de-incentivizing is a word, de-incentivizing poor performance. So as an example, in Ethiopia, the way that they collect in Sidama, the zone from which we buy, the way that the groups work is they have central purchasing locations where there's a representative, basically they call it a cherry buyer from the cooperative, will buy harvested cherries from local producers. So the producers will be harvesting their cherries and they'll bring their cherries by bag, by however they can do it, to the buyer, and the buyer they'll dump out the bag and they'll inspect what the cooperative member is trying to sell. So one of the key indicators at the farm level specifically is picking ripe cherries. So if you spend any time working with quality on the coffee side, red ripe cherries is something that people say all the time, and it's really, really important. If you're not harvesting a red ripe cherry, you're either harvesting a cherry that's not mature or you're harvesting a cherry that's over mature, and both of them have quality problems. So if you pick a green cherry and you go to process that, oftentimes if that cherry makes it all the way through to the roasted cup of coffee, I don't know why it's called a Quaker, but it comes out, that's the name of the defect, but it can be called a Quaker. So it's a really light colored bean. You can tell that this bean was harvested when it was immature. And they can often have flavors that are very astringent, so very drying in the mouth, or very sour, sometimes like peanut or raw corn. And then on the opposite side, if you pick a cherry that's perhaps dried on the tree, or it's overripe, meaning it's gone from red to purple, it can have a real fermented kind of over fruity flavor, which is also not necessarily enjoyable for people. Not fruity in a good way, fruity in a not good way. Which I'm sure everybody's had a piece of fruit where you're like, that's kind of nasty. What was that? And the same thing can happen in your cup of coffee. So they have rules by which they will buy. So if there's a certain, they'll inspect in Sidama, they'll inspect the cherries. If there's too many cherries that are not red, the producer selling the cherry at that moment will need to sort out anything that's not red and ripe. And there's at the co-op level, for instance, in Guatemala, at the Group Manos Campesinas, they have quality standards too, by which coffees are cupped by community, by Manos Campesinas, which is the secondary exporting cooperative. And they have standards that they need to meet every year. And basically, the producer cooperatives will enforce those standards. So if there's a farmer who's not, say, processing the cherry correctly on their farm or not harvesting at the right time, it can be detrimental to the whole group. It's sort of like the bad apple. I guess it's exactly like the bad apple that ruined it for the whole batch. So there is enforcement on the quality side at the producer level. I think I'll leave it at that. But it just depends on where you are and what the group's rules are for that kind of thing.
And I think another important thing is all of this sort of knowledge about what makes a coffee good used to be really, I always say you had to be in New York or Zurich or New Orleans maybe a half a century ago to find anybody who knew this stuff. Only the buyers of coffee had any understanding of quality, and basically a lot of them didn't care either. So the one of the beauties of fair trade, one of the things that makes this a very important movement, is that it is the transparency. The fact that Mike can even be talking with someone who even knows the farmer and who knows these things about quality is really important. And I think another thing about it is the farmer has has some influence or some control over the coffee based on their practices on the farm, in terms of how they take care of the plants and the shade, how they manage the shade, how they manage the soil, and all of these things. And then also the harvesting, as Mike said, when you harvest, and then after the harvest, the care that goes on, because even when you're doing your very best, there's still going to be a bell curve within what you harvest. And you get 500 pounds of coffee, it's going to include some very good and some not as good, and you have to do some sorting. So there are maybe 50 hands that touch coffee, specialty coffee, between the field and the cup. And at every one of those stages, some particular thing is happening, and there's a sorting. And we can talk a little bit about that going too far or not far enough. But figuring there is a market for every bean too. When we're sorting those at the low end, we know where those end up, the mass market coffees.
I'll just say, James, there's a great saying I heard that's exactly what you just said. And I heard somebody explain once that if you think quality-wise for the entire coffee supply chain, there's no one step in the process that can make the coffee taste better than the step before it. There's only things that you can do that will lower the quality. So if it was harvested poorly, you can't roast it to make it taste better than it was harvested. Or if it was processed poorly, you can't roast it to make it taste better than the way it was processed. Literally every step has to be at its peak for the quality to maintain at the highest level, which is difficult to do.
Yeah, and that's very important, because I think in some specialty coffee companies emphasize their genius at the final step. And if you look into their certain companies, just really annoy me when I try to find out what are they doing with this coffee, and they'll talk about their expertise as roasters only. And that's very, very important. But as you said, you can't roast bad coffee to perfection.
You hit on another point too that I'll add on to, and that's you talked about the sort of the coffee knowledge or quality knowledge at the producer level being something sort of new in the past however many decades. That part's really, really important in terms of the market, in terms of what's the word I'm looking for? Benefiting the producer. So for instance, if you're producing coffee and you don't know the quality of your coffee, which in many cases is still true. So if I'm a producer and I'm an Ethiopian coffee farmer and I grow coffee on half a hectare in the Sidama zone, and I'm completely detached from my buyer in West Bridgewater or wherever. And I just pick my coffee and I sell it to the local buyer a couple times a year, and that's it. It just ends there. But I might not know that the coffee I'm producing is super fine, right? I might not be aware that what I'm growing is excellent coffee. And that puts me at a big disadvantage. So there's the importance of communicating quality information back to the producer is absolutely key, absolutely fundamental to what we do at Equal Exchange. Because if you don't know the quality of what you're selling, you could be taken to the bank for sure as a farmer. So it's really important to do that sort of calibrating work with cuppers for the cooperatives, which we do, and then communicating back results. So we communicate back on the coffees so when we approve the coffees, we communicate the quality of what we receive, even if we're gonna reject it. So if we get a coffee, we cup it, we know it's low quality. We don't just say, okay, send us something done. We need to move on to the next thing. We will write up reports and send it back. We're going to reject this coffee. This is the reason why we're rejecting this coffee. This is what we think is the cause of the problem. And that goes through to export as well. So when the coffee arrives, let's say we've approved a coffee and we purchased it and it ships and it comes to the US, we will do another report that matches up with the pre-shipment sample, and we send all that information back. And then at the end of the year, we do a full quality review too with everything that we received from the producer group. I have some photos of that too from the Ethiopian slides that we're going to show you. But that piece is crucial, especially for us because we do all the importing work too. So we have to communicate clearly the whole chain. Otherwise, the chain doesn't really work. Poor quality doesn't do anybody any good. And so you got to talk through it and communicate through it to raise
something too, Mike. So when we were like kind of talking about this event, we'd like talked about Equal Exchange's approach to quality and this metaphor that I'm probably going to mess up. So maybe someone else should jump in with it. Oh. But I just remember like for me, I just not understanding this stuff, and like I learned a ton by like going on my delegation, and we were just kind of like in the where the person who basically is in charge of quality on their end, like checking to see if there's rocks or, leaves and debris and other things like, kind of their quality check. And so we just kind of looked around at the different lots and like how they're labeled. And there was this like lot that was like separate. And so like, a few folks were like asking questions about that, right? Like what's going on with this lot? Like it's over here, it's separate. Like, what does that mean? Like, oh, this is a micro lot. Like this is going to like, somewhere in Minneapolis. Like I actually don't remember what the name of the company was, but it was like this super specialty, like rated like 85. And then we'd kind of gone into this like debate and discussion about like, what does that mean? And like this farmer is the only one like getting, or benefiting from, this lot, what's going on with the entire community. And then, so someone jump in with that boat water metaphor to kind of like explain this. Cause I feel like that's like kind of the meat of like this and what I was imagining, right? Like, what do we think the perfect cup of coffee is, right? And it's not going to be like that 87 of like that one farmer. Like we're really trying to elevate like the entire community of farmers. The metaphor, what was it? I feel like
I think it was a rising tide raising all boats, and so a focus on quality would be that rising tide. If you do a certain amount of selection, but not an extreme amount of selection. And I've even seen, I have some friends on large farms that even on their large farm, they don't do micro lots. They say, we want everything that comes off this farm to have a good reputation. And that's Selva Negra, which you've been to, Danielle. We have a certain standard we want all of our coffee to be known for. That at the low end will go into the commodity market. With the stuff we're discarding, we won't put our name on, goes into the commodity market. But all of the better coffee, even at the high end, we're going to mix in so that we have a really strong coffee for the whole farm. And that can apply in a community as well. And I think Mike has had some discomfort with people who separate too much at the high end.
Yeah, we've had experiences with farmer cooperatives where they have, several of the groups that we've worked with have done a lot of microlots in the past. So in case it's not clear at this point, a microlot is a producer might produce, let's say 100 pounds of coffee. Usually it's more than 100 pounds, it's just an easy number. And a very small amount of that 100 pounds of coffee might be very, very good, very, very good. And so a microlot might be that that producer would take those 10 pounds of very, very high quality coffee and then sell those at a premium. And then the remaining 90 pounds of coffee would get sold however it's sold. The problem with that is it lowers the quality of the other 90 pounds. And then when you get to at a cooperative scale, it's a problem yet again, because lots of times microlots, if a buyer comes in and wants to purchase microlots from a cooperative, in some cases what you're doing is you're pulling an individual farmer, you're pulling them out of the cooperative model, and you're sourcing directly from them. And so that can create some agitation, obviously, at the cooperative level, right? So if you have one producer whose coffee gets pulled out and it's very good coffee, the rest of the farmers can sometimes be at a disadvantage. So we've worked with a couple of groups who have told us, you know, we did microlots, we're done. We're not doing that anymore. It's expensive, and we don't always have a market for it, and it's just not good for the whole. So some groups still do microlots and will still do very specific things for specific buyers, but there's a real beauty in buying the mountain, as some people say, where we go in and we want to make sure that we're buying at scale, because that's where we're having the most effect for the most producers. And that's the other piece too, is a lot of groups will tell you that roasters will tell you that their number one goal is quality. Our number one goal is quality. We only want the best coffee no matter what. That to me is not a very noble cause. If you can come in with money from the north and just buy whatever at whatever price and sell it in the US at $10 a cup, that to me is not very interesting. You're not exactly a change agent at that point. You're more just 1%ing for the 1%. So for us, it's much more interesting to go and try to improve quality at a cooperative wide level. We work with quality staff at the producer cooperative so they know what we want. We have clear expectations. We calibrate on cuppings, which means we go and we cup with them and we talk about what we're tasting. We have a lot of experience doing that, and actually put in some slides from Guatemala that are some good examples of us doing that in Guatemala, not only with the quality staff at Manos Campesinas, which is a cooperative in San Marcos, but also with coffee cuppers from 3 different cooperatives in Chiapas in Mexico who were there. So that to us is a much more interesting and much more rewarding work to do than just buying and selling the highest quality stuff, because it's not, obviously quality is very important for us and we have extremely rigorous quality standards, but it's not, you know, we're not trying to buy one farmer's 10 pounds. That's not gonna change the world.
Awesome. I think maybe we'll jump into the photos.
Yeah, sure.
And then we'll try to leave a lot of room for discussion so people can kind of voice their questions.
I can go through mine really pretty quickly, Danielle.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna share my screen now.
So Danielle's gonna bring up some pictures from a trip not last year. I think it was last year or the year before last year. The most experience I have directly with producer groups is in Ethiopia. And so, as I mentioned, we buy from an exporting union there called the Sidama Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union. And how it works in Ethiopia is individual primary cooperatives, which are smaller producer cooperatives, will join together and form an exporting union. That's the verbiage they use in Ethiopia. And these unions are usually set up by production zone in Ethiopia. So you have the Sidama Coffee Farmers Union, the Oromia Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union, Yirgacheffe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in Ethiopia, the producers have very, very, very small farms. I'm talking half a hectare to a hectare, literally like a garden. And in most cases, that's the only thing that they produce for export or the only thing they produce for sales. So you're talking about very, very small farms and very, very massive exporting unions. So I think the first time when we first started purchasing from the Sidama Union, is what we call it for short, there were something like 80,000 members, which is a massive, massive cooperative. For instance, in Bolivia, we buy from groups that are maybe 50 producers or 40 producers as a comparison. And they have much bigger farms in Bolivia. And then the last time we were there, their membership is up to over 100,000. So you can imagine the challenges in having an exporting union with 100,000 small producers in rural Ethiopia. So some of these pictures are from when Todd Casperson and I went. Todd Casperson is the vice president and the director of purchasing and production and producer relations. So this trip, he and I went there with the goal of bringing roasted Ethiopian coffee, our finished product that if you buy our Ethiopian coffee, it's that coffee. And buying and brewing the coffee for the producers in Sidama, which sounds very simple to do, but in most cases, many of these farmers have never had their exported coffee. They only drink whatever they don't export and sell to the local market. So they're used to drinking their very poor quality stuff. Ethiopia is a little bit different because they have a very, very strong coffee drinking culture in Ethiopia. And the number is very high. I think that in terms of consumption, the number I heard, and I actually can't verify it, but it's something like 40% of export quality stuff is consumed in country, which is very, very high. So this is Deme Regasa on the right. And we are at a primary cooperative here called Telamo. And Telamo is one of 20 primary cooperatives, I believe it's 20 at this point, that own the exporting union. So Deme's job is he's the quality control manager. And so Deme was with us traveling. Language is a big barrier for buyers in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, there's something like 80 languages. And so Deme is from Oromia originally. So his native language is Oromifa. The producers that we're visiting are in an area called Sidama, and they speak Sidaminia. And so Deme his English is very good. And his Oromia, he's fluent Oromifa speaker. And his Sidaminia is maybe at 80% is what he told me. So we're translating from 3 different languages as we meet with the producers here. So you can go to the next slide. You can see this is obviously a small cross-section of the Telamo cooperative. There's about 3,000 producers who are members of Telamo. And usually when we have these types of meetings in Ethiopia, it's members of the board of directors that are meeting with us there. So this was very, very interesting, not just for us, but also for the producers, because they'd never had their exported coffee. 2, they'd never had their coffee made for them by a man. And 3, they'd never had their coffee made for them by a white man. So there were lots of various levels of interesting things happening for everybody. So it was cool to bring them coffee from Telamo and roasted, and we brought a propane tank burner and we made coffee for everybody. It was really a very fascinating trip. So you can go to the next slide. This was later on in the trip. So there's Deme on the left. This is around the coffee cupping table at the Sidama Union's old office. You can see I brought references. A lot of what we do as tasting is referencing things. So when we're talking about flavors that we're getting in coffee, we want to make sure that Deme has the same references that we do. So one thing that's quite common in the coffees we get from Ethiopia is the flavor of blueberries. They don't have blueberries in Ethiopia. So you try to bring things that taste like blueberries or references like blueberries. But as an example, I brought some of our dried mangoes, some almonds and cashews and raisins with us so that we could taste. The 2 men on the right are Moise and Ismail. Moise is from a group called Sopakti in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ismail is from a group called Muungano, which is also in the DRC. So we were able to get some funding we were trying to get Moise and Ismail to the United States to do a calibration session with them over the course of a week. So basically make sure that we have the same language around what we're tasting in coffee. But we couldn't get them visas. which is very, very common issue with bringing producers or representatives from producer groups to the US. But we were able to get them visas to Ethiopia. So Moise and Ismail took the long motorcycle ride to the airport to fly from DRC to Ethiopia. And I went and picked them up at the airport. And we went and spent a whole week with Deme and Mena, a woman who works in the coffee lab with Deme. So we spent a whole week calibrating on roasting, different procedures for roasting coffee, how to properly cup, sorting coffee, etc. What's cool is Deme's been doing basically the same job as me, but on the producer side for the same amount of time. So he comes with the same amount of experience as I do. I think it's also cool that he's African, he's from Ethiopia, and he has a different set of, obviously a much different set of experiences than me. So to have him there with his coffee expertise was much more relatable for Moise and Ismail on the producer side and also on the African side, which was a very, very cool trip. We had translators too because Moise and Ismail speak very little English, but they do speak French. So there was some, language is always an issue. Next slide. And this is a different trip that I went on more recently with Ian McMillan, who's our production manager. So this is also at Telamo several years later. And every year when we visit producer groups, we make sure that we bring in quality results to them. So this is me going over how not just the other coffees that we buy from the Sidama Union, but also the coffee that we buy specifically from Telamo, because we get coffee specifically from them and a number of other groups. Each container that we buy from Ethiopia, each lot, is broken out by producer cooperative. So I find these exchanges really interesting because it's good to provide context. So we're saying, this is all the different countries that we buy from. Of what we buy, the stuff we get from Africa is a smaller percentage by far than what we get from Central and South America. And then also to sort of, so maybe 5% of what we purchase is from Ethiopia, but it's a very important origin. So it's good to frame it. This was also an interesting visit because they were ready to be done because they were dispersing their second payment as part of fair trade premiums. So they were like, okay, thank you. We've got to go deliver money to farmers now. So they moved on to the next piece. You can go to the next slide. And so that's Deme and Mena on that trip as well. This is cool because we're bringing some coffee from Honduras that was naturally processed. We buy a few naturally processed coffees from Honduras, which is just a different way of processing. And all the coffee that we buy from Ethiopia is naturally processed. So I wanted to bring that with us so that Deme and Mena could taste it. And that was very cool. We shared those results with Komsatu in Honduras so they could find out what the Ethiopian cuppers thought of there. And there's Ian with Deme going over one of the specific lots that they were going to send us a sample for, just explaining some of the harvesting processes and the different ways that they process it. Next. And there's Deme, Moise and Ismail, sorry. Next. And Telamo, cheersing. This is just an example of a quality report that we share with producers. So we use a software called Cropster for all of our cupping and all of our tracking of quality data. And this is one specific container that has all the cupping and sorting results. This would be included in this report would be the quality of the coffee before purchase. So we could compare what we approved with what arrived in the United States. This is a critical link to what we do at Equal Exchange. You can see the score is 86.75 on the far right. That's a very, very high scoring coffee, especially for 360 kilogram bags. Next. And here's just a few pictures from Guatemala. This is Manos Campesinas. This is a varietal cupping event that we were doing. Yep, perfect. And there's Kim Coburn, one of the green buyers, and I with the cuppers from Chiapas and the cuppers from Guatemala, from San Marcos. And there's Carlos and Miguel and I on one of the model plots. Very cool trip. I'll pass it off. James, your turn.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's really fascinating. So I just want to talk a little bit about experience in Nicaragua, and I'm a geographer, so I always start with a map. And the coffee, Nicaragua is this triangle. The Caribbean side is low forested area. I've never been to any of that. The majority of the population lives in big cities along the Pacific coast, between and near those big lakes. And then up in a kind of a triangle to the north of those lakes, Matagalpa, Inotega, Nueva Segovia, up toward the border with Honduras is where the coffee comes from. And that's the part of Nicaragua I'm most familiar with. And Matagalpa is the part that I consider my home away from home, quite literally. Sometimes people think I actually own a house in Matagalpa because I describe it so much as my home since I've been going there from almost every year from 2006 to 2018, when the politics of Nicaragua rocked us, and we haven't been able to take groups back since then. Next, please. So kind of an interesting thing, I used to work in a totally different part of the food business and learned about quality control from that point of view in the ISO 9000 system. And I was amazed when I got to Nicaragua, to this drying patio, when I first started learning about how the process works, and find out that they have, there aren't as many computers involved as what I had in my previous life, but they were actually using ISO 9000, which means that there's tracking, the knowing where each lot of coffee comes from, all the way from the farm up through, or at least the local cooperative up through the producer, is really important. So there, these all over this patio, they had these tags. These slides these images are from a Canadian photojournalist named Matt Cady, who joined me, happened to kind of crash my tour in 2007 and took these wonderful photos. This is the drying patio, and you can actually see, if you squint a little bit, you might notice those red tags on the ground. This is at Sol Cafe, where the coffee is being gathered, dried, and then being readied for milling and processing. It starts by spreading it out on concrete patios. And this is one of their quality control people. He's doing this rubbing together because it's very important to move the coffee when it gets to the correct moisture. And he's estimating that by how he rubs it together. He's been doing this for years. And he says, this needs like 20 more minutes. And I wasn't sure if he was kidding or not, but it had been out there for like a week. So yeah, 20 more minutes. And then it has to be carried in. Next, please. Like I said, at every step here, there is separation. This is called the band. A lot of this is done all over the world, although increasingly it's done with machines now. These optical readers have replaced a lot of this labor. Everybody here wearing a yellow smock is part of the actual quality control team, separating out defects visually. Everybody not wearing the gear is a student of mine, just trying to practice this. And it is hard. Like anybody's job you don't actually know how to do, it's harder than it looks. Students reported getting a little seasick just trying this. But that's my student Vanessa, and then in the background another student, Anthony, trying this out. And then this is the cupping lab. This is the first cupping lab in the world at Sol Cafe. From what we were told, the first cupping lab in the world, owned by farmer cooperatives. And you see a few of my students sitting around. And then the woman on the left is somebody who started on a farm, and then she worked on that patio, like raking the coffee. And then she worked on that band, selecting it. And now she is a taster, a cupping expert, and she's showing us how she does the cupping. And I include this because her sense of responsibility for what she does when she writes a report, and that's going to accompany a sample that goes to a buyer like Mike, to a quality person like Mike on the other side, and then eventually it's going to be attached to a 37,000 pound shipment. She takes that responsibility extremely seriously. Next, please. This is just to show that information comes back to the farm, and just knowing how to pick. Now, these aren't necessarily perfectly red ripe because these are, me and my students picked a lot of this coffee. This guy is probably looking a little askance at like, oh, these aren't quite right, but they're showing us how it works. And then I think the last one that I have, this is the Rio Granado family, who I stayed with sort of by accident my first time, and then I've stayed with all but one trip since then. I've stayed with this family. Every time the necklaces I'm wearing are made by Alfredo there on the left. We've tried bringing him to the United States. As Mike said, it's very difficult. He's been on one tour, but when I tried to bring him back for another, we weren't able. But the ability of him to now have a college degree, and so does his sister, all of that comes from fair trade, and all of that comes from knowing how to improve the quality of their coffee. And now I'm a little homesick.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. That was a lot, but I do want to open it up and encourage everybody to kind of voice their questions and kind of engage in a discussion. I know Janet had the first question, but I know my coworkers are probably keeping a stack, which would be great. But I think, yeah, we can just kind of jump in.
So I have so many questions, but I'll start with the ones that I wrote here. So what are you tasting for in different coffees? Like you talked about tasting for blueberries and whatever.
Sure.
How's it different in the different regions, and what I don't know. I mean, how's it different in the different regions? What you taste for? And
Sure.
Range.
Yeah. So yeah, it's probably best to answer that with specifics. But so we have a few key things that we're tasting for. One is that specialty coffee has to be sweet. When you say that to people, most people are like, what are you talking about? Coffee's not sweet, but it is. And the more you taste coffees, the more you taste bad coffees versus good coffees, you can taste that there's sweetness inherent in the coffee itself. So it has to be sweet. It has to be clean, which means when we're tasting the coffees, it has to be defect free. So we get a sample, we roast 90 grams. It's a very small amount. And we cup 60 grams broken out into 6 10-gram cups. Why we're doing that is we're breaking the single sample into small pieces and tasting each piece. Because when you do it that way, you can pick out if there's defects inside the sample. And you can taste it, different defects are caused by different things, and you can usually taste what the problem is. So you can taste if it's improperly processed or improperly harvested, or if there was a lot of insect damage, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing that we're looking for. And then in terms of, so coffee has to be sweet, it has to be clean, and it has to have what we call special characteristics. There has to be something special about it. And this is sort of the circumstance by which we're buying by group. So the coffee that we buy from a group called Aspro Café and Gruma in Colombia, we expect that the coffee from them usually it has very good acidity, very high acidity in a good way. It's usually got a lot of body. Usually it tastes like grapefruits, or it can have an herbal note or a lime note. So when we're tasting coffee from Ngruma, we're usually expecting those types of flavors in those coffees. And they know that. And Helica, who's the cupper for Ngruma, knows what we're looking for. And so when she's blending the coffees from the different producer groups that make up that cooperative, she's putting the coffees together to meet those profiles so that when it's sent it to Equal Exchange, we're approving it. That's just one example. The coffee that we get from Guatemala, for instance, from Manos Campesinas, sometimes we're looking for like orange flavors, sometimes also grapefruit from Guatemala, funny enough, and sometimes an herbal note that we're looking for. It all just depends on the different groups. Ethiopia's blueberries, stuff from Sumatra is different, stuff from Nicaragua is way different. Yeah. James?
I was just going to add that I am no tasting expert, but for somebody like me who can't necessarily pick out those things on my own, one thing I can do is if a blueberry is in the profile and I serve that with a blueberry dessert, it really comes alive. In all of those more subtle flavors, just like with wines, if there's a subtle flavor there, if you pair it with a food that has that same note, you'll notice it better.
Yeah.
It's my amateur take on it.
Hi, Nancy here. Great so far. I was wondering, looking at the some of the cupping in place, is literacy an issue? So often people have a great deal of non-formal education, but if you're expected to write stuff on a form, I wonder if that excludes some people. And also, there were an awful lot of guys there, and it's wonderful to see the woman doing the cupping, but I also noticed those very attractive young women in the yellow aprons doing what I think was maybe hard work, and just wondering about the gender, some of the gender differentials there might be.
Sure. James, you want to start? Or?
Sure, yes. You're absolutely right. I've never seen a guy working on the band, and rarely seen women at the higher order jobs, although that is changing in Nicaragua especially. There's a group we did visit on my last trip there, Las Idosas, the goddesses. There's an entirely women-owned cooperative up in the north of the country, specifically working on addressing that and doing it fairly well. But there has really been a gender imbalance. Literacy in Nicaragua, literacy is pretty widespread, I'd say. The higher end cupping jobs are pretty specialized though, and yeah, if you weren't literate, that would be a really hard job to learn.
Yes, I would agree. I can't really speak to literacy throughout the whole supply chain. I can say that James is correct in that as far as I know, most of the cuppers that we work with, I believe, are literate for report writing and that kind of thing, so they can communicate back and forth. All of which is in Spanish, basically, with the exception of Africa and Asia, when we're communicating in English in those cases. In terms of women, I completely agree. I've never seen a woman sorting coffee at a sorting mill before, ever. In Ethiopia, I've got pictures in Ethiopia of dozens of women at the band sorting. And gender equity is a big issue at Source. And it's definitely something that Equal Exchange is focusing on. It's by no means, I would say, buying fair trade coffee, you should not have any illusions that it's some better gender equity situation. I think the beauty in buying from somebody like us is that we recognize that it's an issue, and we work with cooperatives to let them know that we think it's an issue. So going to Ethiopia, every time I introduce Equal Exchange, so every time I go to the producer cooperative, and I do a small presentation about the history of Equal Exchange. And one of the first things I do is I say, Equal Exchange is a worker-owned cooperative. I don't have an exact number. Usually companies have to certify it. I've never certified it, but I'm like, we're about 50% owned by women. And our board of directors is, right now, our board of directors is it just changed. So we just had board elections. But before that, it was 1 man and 8 women, or something like that. And sometimes there's a gap, an audible like, whoa, that's different, right? I've met 1 female board member in Ethiopia at one of the cooperatives. Definitely an issue. And farm ownership is also an issue there. We're 4,000 farmers. I say, great, how many of them are men and how many of them are women? And they're like, it's 3,950 men and 50 women. And in most cases, they're widows, right? It's that they were literally deeded farms by the death of their husband and that kind of situation. So it's a complete inequity that is recognized and such, and it's something that we're working on, because to be authentic, you have to address the problem and work at it, right? So it's incredibly challenging in the US even. I hope that answers your question, Nancy.
I have a question. Thanks so much, by the way, for the presentation. The question is about the lower quality stuff that seems like it's probably inevitable that there's going to be some on any coffee farm. And do you all ever consider like sort of selling that as a lower priced fair trade option?
We do not. We have, James is right. There's a market for every coffee. No matter what's produced, it will get sold. Our standards are pretty rigorous, where we meet specialty coffee standards. So we don't accept coffees that are below 80 points, which sounds low, but 80-point coffee is difficult to produce. But they will always have a place to sell that coffee. There have been some circumstances in the past. So for instance, in Congo, when we first, the very, very beginning, started that relationship, which, I don't even know, maybe 10 years ago, we took a risk and bought coffee at them substandard. And the whole idea was that another group that was an NGO that was working with them to get Sapakti to market, to sell something, to have capital, to then invest in quality so that they could get more market share in the United States. We took the risk and bought stuff sub-quality, and we had other places that we could sell that weren't within our normal supply chain. And we joked that we called it solidarity grade. It wasn't specialty grade, it was solidarity grade coffee. And it was super critical because I think we bought that coffee and it was sub 80 points, let's just say 72 points. Honest to God, the next year that we bought the coffee, it came in at something like an 87, which is super, super high quality. And so that was a gamble that we took. And now if you look, coffees, specialty coffees that are coming out of the DRC are very, very high quality. And I'd like to think we played a part in that. It's companies that can take a risk, that are like, look, we're gonna take the hit so that we can sort of increase market share, increase capital on the producer side. But as a rule, no, we don't buy that stuff generally.
Dan also had a question. He said his internet is not great right now. Is coffee rust or other fungi disease still a major threat?
It's subsided to some extent. I'll speak to this as much as I know about it. Our buyers obviously know way more about this than I do, but when coffee leaf rust was starting to break out, a lot of the cooperatives took a mad scramble to sort of stem the disaster before it hit. So a lot of groups clear cut their farms and started planting other varietals that were more disease resistant. A lot of those varietals, the jury was out on their quality because some of them are crossbred with what's called Robusta, which is a different type of quality that's lower quality than Arabica, a different kind of coffee that's lower quality than Arabica. But a lot of them took that risk, and well, a lot of them lost their farms. So Manos Campesinas, again, that group in Guatemala, their harvest was hit something like 80%. They lost 80% of their product. So if you can imagine, one year you go to get your paycheck or whatever at the end of the year, and you're like, damn, I made 20% of what I made last year. You got to start somewhere to rebuild that. So they did that with varietals. So you see a lot of groups are coming back out of that, but there are quality implications for that. So that cupping work that we were doing in Guatemala was led by Manos Campesinas, where they had 5 different farms in 5 different communities where they planted 5 different varietals of Arabica coffee. And we did 2 years, it was a 3-year study. We did 2 years of the study with them and another coffee buyer, where we were analyzing the quality, but they were also looking at things like infection rates from Roya, which is Spanish sort of slang or name for coffee leaf rust, and another one called Ojo de Gallo. And they were looking at disease resistance, productivity, and quality in these varietals by these communities, and which have different shade canopy and different other things, as James mentioned, specific to each farm. So they have a lot of data for that. Unfortunately, we were going to go this last year and sort of cap it off with another round of cupping, but I was going to be there this week actually, but COVID put the COVID put the kibosh on that. So that is done, but there's other groups that are doing the same thing.
If I can add just a little bit about that, the story of leaf rust with Manos Campesinas in Guatemala is part of the film Connected by Coffee, which is a great, I think, a great documentary about coffees in Mexico and Central America. The family I showed you, the Rayo family I showed you in my slides, they lost 7,000 out of their 8,000 trees to Roya. They were able to come back in part because they were diversified within their income stream within the family. Fair trade had allowed them to have better schooling, and so there was some subsidy from off farm. And they also invested in, when they replanted, they not only replanted coffee, but expanded their chocolate, their cacao, and also greatly expanded the variety of food that they produced on their farm, so that I've been there for a few days and eaten only food grown on the farm. And so they diversified in a variety of senses of the word following the Roya outbreak, and they've been okay since then.
I might just add one more quick to that. And I know, Danielle, I'm looking at the clock. And that's that an interesting little tidbit on genetic diversity with Arabica is that 99% of the genetic diversity of Arabica exists only within Ethiopia. So 1% of the diversity exists in the rest of the world. And so there's a lot of research happening now to try to find other sort of natural mutations, other varieties that are grown wild in Ethiopia and look at their potential for export to hedge their bets against things like Roya and Ohodagayo and other just devastating diseases. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Obviously, there's so much to this, and quality is really complicated. And I think that was kind of why I wanted to open up this discussion and kind of from two different perspectives, which I thought was really cool. So thank you all for participating. We recorded it, so we'll be sending that out if some people had to sign off early, which I guess they're not here to hear that anyway, but maybe they'll read their email. And I just wanted to remind folks that we have a member meeting coming up July 8th at 7 p.m. We sent out the invite for that yesterday. So if you haven't registered yet, we'll also send out another reminder. And we also sent out the summit recording. So obviously there were some simultaneous sessions. If there was something you missed and you want to kind of check it out, definitely take a look at that. And thank you, Mike and James, so much for this. It was great. And excited that we can still do this kind of stuff while we're all stuck at home and not able to travel. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.